Welcome to the Secret Lives channel.
They say the loudest sound in a dying marriage is the slam of a door. But when Caroline Sterling finally left, there was no slamming door, no screamed accusations echoing through their pristine Connecticut foyer, and no tearful ultimatums. There was only the soft click of a deadbolt turning and the low hum of a waiting town car. Her husband, a man who had built his entire identity on the absolute assumption of her insignificance, wouldn't notice she was gone for another 14 hours. He thought he was losing a meek, dependent wife who would soon come crawling back. He had no idea he was about to declare war on a ghost who owned half of Wall Street. The sprawling 10,000-square-foot estate in Westport, Connecticut, was suffocatingly quiet on the night of October 14th. Caroline Sterling stood in the center of the master bedroom, her posture impossibly straight, bathed in the moonlight that spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She was a woman of 42, though her quiet demeanor and tendency to wear muted, oversized cashmere sweaters often made her fade into the background of her own life. That, however, had been entirely by design. At her feet sat a single, scuffed leather duffel bag. Inside were 3 pairs of jeans, a handful of unassuming blouses, her passport, and a secure, encrypted hard drive that held the architecture of an empire. She walked over to the custom-built mahogany vanity. Resting on the marble surface was a velvet box containing a diamond tennis bracelet, a gift from her husband, Henry, presented to her last Christmas with the distinct air of a king throwing a scrap to a loyal peasant. Next to it lay a platinum Rolex she had never liked. She left them both. She took nothing that Henry had bought her, nothing that tied her to the financial leash he believed he held her by. 50 miles away, in the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel in Manhattan, Henry Sterling was holding court. He was 45, handsome in a sharply tailored tuxedo, with the kind of aggressively white smile that belonged on a billboard. As a senior vice president at the wealth management firm of Harrison, Lynch and Davies, Henry considered himself a titan of industry. Tonight, he was receiving an award for securing a massive portfolio of new high-net-worth clients. Clinging to his arm, laughing a little too loudly at his jokes, was Chloe Kensington. Chloe was 28, a junior analyst at his firm, and possessed a ruthless ambition masked by wide, admiring eyes. Henry had told Caroline that the gala was a tedious, mandatory corporate slog, and that she would be bored out of her mind. Caroline had simply smiled, kissed his cheek, and told him to have a good time. It was the same lie he had told her for the last 3 years, and the same smile she had returned it with. Back in Westport, Caroline moved down the sweeping staircase, her steps making no sound on the thick Persian runners. She paused at the doorway of what Henry affectionately called her little hobby room. To Henry, the room was where Caroline did freelance bookkeeping for local mom and pop shops to keep herself busy, since they had never had children. He routinely mocked her setup, laughing at the multiple monitors and the heavy-duty cooling fans she had installed. "Playing at Wall Street, sweetheart," he would chuckle, patting her condescendingly on the head before leaving for his real job. She didn't look into the room. The servers were already wiped. The encrypted tunnels to her offshore servers in Zurich and Singapore were severed and relocated. The physical hardware left behind was nothing more than a hollow shell, much like their marriage. For 10 years, Caroline had played the role of the dutiful, quiet wife. When they met, she had been a brilliant but introverted mathematics PhD student, and he had been a charismatic MBA candidate. Henry had consumed all the oxygen in the room, and Caroline had let him. She had liked the quiet shadow he cast. It gave her a place to hide. But over the years, his shadow had grown heavy, turning from a shelter into a cage. He belittled her intelligence, controlled her access to the joint checking account, and flaunted his infidelities with the careless cruelty of a man who believes his wife is too helpless to ever leave. Caroline walked into the massive, sterile chef's kitchen. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her wedding band, a modest gold ring with a 2-carat diamond. She didn't throw it. She didn't cry. With terrifying precision, she placed it perfectly in the center of the kitchen island. Underneath the ring lay a thick manila envelope. Inside were divorce papers, already signed by her, drawn up not by a local family attorney, but by Arthur Pendleton of Pendleton, Gray and Associates. Henry, despite his self-proclaimed status in the financial world, wouldn't recognize the name. Pendleton didn't represent vice presidents. Pendleton represented foreign dignitaries, anonymous billionaires, and silent institutional titans. Caroline walked out the front door, pulling it shut behind her. The heavy mahogany clicked into place. A sleek black town car was idling in the circular driveway. The driver, a discreet man named Thomas, opened the rear door. "JFK, Mum?" he asked quietly. "No, Thomas," Caroline replied, her voice smooth and devoid of tremor. "Take me to the penthouse in Tribeca. It's time I finally moved in." As the car pulled away, crunching over the gravel, Caroline didn't look back at the $10 million house. She simply opened a sleek tablet, typed in a 40-character encryption key, and watched as a screen filled with lines of executing code lit up her face in the dark. The ghost was finally waking up. Henry Sterling woke up at 11 a.m. the next morning. His head pounded with the dull, rhythmic ache of vintage champagne and top-shelf scotch. He was tangled in the expensive Egyptian cotton sheets of his master bed, the lingering scent of Chloe's Tom Ford black orchid perfume still clinging to his skin. He had dropped Chloe off at her apartment at 3 a.m. before returning to Westport, assuming he would find Caroline asleep in the guest room, where she had been sleeping for the past year due to his snoring. He rolled over, rubbing his eyes, and yelled towards the hallway, "Caroline, make some coffee, and find my Advil." Silence answered him. Frowning, Henry dragged himself out of bed. He threw on a silk robe and padded downstairs, irritated. "Caroline, did you hear me?" he barked, stepping into the kitchen. The room was empty. The espresso machine was cold. And then he saw it. The manila envelope on the island, pinned down by the gold and diamond ring. Henry stared at the ring for a long moment. A slow, incredulous smirk spread across his face. He picked up the ring, tossed it in the air, and caught it. "Dramatic," he muttered. He picked up the envelope, tore it open, and skimmed the first page. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Petitioner, Caroline Hayes Sterling. Respondent, Henry Robert Sterling. Henry laughed out loud, a harsh, barking sound that echoed in the empty kitchen. She actually did it, he thought. The little mouse finally snapped. He flipped to the back page, looking for her demands. He expected a plea for the house, a desperate request for spousal support, maybe a tearful handwritten letter. Instead, there was just standard legal boilerplate and the signature of a lawyer he'd never heard of. He immediately picked up his phone and dialed Richard Hughes. Richard was a notorious bulldog of a divorce attorney in Fairfield County, famous for leaving ex-wives financially ruined and emotionally shattered. "Richard, it's Henry Sterling," he said, leaning against the marble counter. "My wife has decided to play a game. She left some papers on the counter and took off." "I'm sorry to hear that, Henry," Richard's gravelly voice replied, though he didn't sound sorry at all. "Do you know where she is?" "Probably at some cheap motel off the interstate, realizing her credit card is about to bounce," Henry sneered. "I want you to freeze all the joint accounts immediately. Cancel her secondary Amex. Cut off her cell phone plan. Let's see how long she enjoys her little rebellion when she can't buy her organic groceries." "Standard procedure," Richard said smoothly. "Bring the papers into my office on Monday. We'll file a countersuit. If she abandoned the marital home, we have leverage. Does she have any independent income?" "Caroline?" Henry scoffed. "She balances checkbooks for local bakeries. She makes maybe 10 grand a year. She has absolutely nothing without me." "Then she'll be back by Wednesday," Richard predicted. But Wednesday came and went, and Caroline did not return. The silence from her end was absolute. There were no panicked phone calls when her credit card was declined, no angry texts when her phone was deactivated. It was as if she had stepped off the face of the earth. Henry's amusement began to curdle into annoyance. He didn't miss her company, but he missed her utility. He missed having his dry cleaning picked up, his meals arranged, and the house perfectly managed. Chloe was fun, but Chloe expected to be taken to expensive dinners. She didn't want to cook them. By the second week, Henry was sitting in Richard Hughes's plush office, tapping his foot impatiently. "So where do we stand?" Henry asked, checking his Rolex. "I want to serve her the countersuit. Have your private investigator found out which rock she's hiding under?" Richard sat behind his heavy oak desk, looking uncharacteristically tense. He cleared his throat. "Henry, there are a few irregularities." "Irregularities like what?" "First, the joint accounts," Richard said, looking down at a file. "When my team went to freeze them, we found that the primary checking account had exactly $4,000 in it." Henry frowned. "That's impossible. My quarterly bonus hit last month. There should be over $200,000 in there." "The funds were transferred out 3 days before she left," Richard explained. "Legally, as a joint account holder, she has the right to move those funds." Henry's face flushed dark red. "She stole my money. That bitch, I'll have her arrested. It's not theft in a marriage, Henry. It's marital assets. We'll claim it back in discovery," Richard said, trying to soothe him. "But there's a larger issue. The house." "What about the house? The mortgage is in my name." "Actually, it's not," Richard said slowly. 3 years ago, when you were facing that potential SEC investigation regarding the insider trading allegations, I was cleared of that," Henry snapped defensively. "Yes, but during the panic, you and Caroline transferred the deed of the Westport estate into an irrevocable trust to protect it from potential asset seizure." "Right. The Sterling Family Trust. I know. What of it?" "Henry, you aren't the trustee," Richard said softly. "Caroline is. And according to the bylaws of the trust, which you signed, she has sole discretion over the property. You don't own the house, Henry. She does. And her lawyer sent us a notice of eviction this morning. You have 30 days to vacate the premises." Henry stood up so fast his leather chair crashed backward into the wall. "Eviction? From my own house? Who the hell is this lawyer? Some strip mall hack she found online?" "Arthur Pendleton," Richard read from the paper. He looked up, his face grim. "He's not a strip mall hack, Henry. Pendleton is a senior partner at Pendleton and Gray. Their minimum retainer is $500,000. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Henry stared at his lawyer, his mind spinning, trying to connect the meek woman in the oversized sweaters with a $500,000 legal retainer. "That's a mistake," Henry said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "She doesn't have that kind of money. She's bluffing. Set up a mediation. I want her in a room. Once she sees me, she'll crack. She always cracks." 4 days later, Henry and Richard sat in a glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper. The plaque on the door read, "Pendleton, Gray, and Associates." The room smelled of expensive leather, old money, and quiet power. The heavy oak door clicked open. Henry leaned forward, a condescending sneer ready on his lips, fully expecting to see Caroline walk in, trembling and looking at the floor. Instead, a tall, distinguished man in his late 60s, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit, entered alone. He carried a single, slim leather portfolio. He sat down opposite them, exuding the calm, terrifying aura of a predator that knows it has already won. "Mr. Sterling," the man said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone, "I am Arthur Pendleton. I represent your wife." "Where is she?" Henry demanded, slamming his hand on the table. "Tell her to get in here. I'm not playing this ridiculous proxy game." "Mrs. Sterling has no desire to see you, nor is she legally required to be present for this preliminary disclosure," Pendleton said calmly. opening his portfolio. "Listen to me, Pendleton," Richard Hughes barked, leaning in and using his best courtroom intimidation tactic. "Your client has illegally transferred marital funds. She is attempting an unlawful eviction on a property paid for by my client, and she is acting in bad faith. We are prepared to drag her through a brutal litigation process that will leave her completely bankrupt. Tell her to drop this charade, return the $200,000, and we might let her walk away with a modest alimony." Pendleton didn't blink. He didn't even look at Richard. He simply pulled a single sheet of heavily watermarked paper from his portfolio and slid it across the polished mahogany table toward Henry. "In the interest of transparency and expedited proceedings, Mrs. Sterling has authorized me to provide you with her preliminary statement of independent assets, accrued prior to and entirely separate from the marital estate," Pendleton said, his voice devoid of emotion. Henry snatched the paper, ready to laugh at a list containing a 6-year-old Honda Civic and a few $1,000s in a secret savings account. He looked at the top line. His eyes narrowed. He looked again. All the blood drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of grey. His hands began to shake violently. There, neatly typed under the heading "Liquid Assets and Equity Holdings," was a number. It wasn't a number in the thousands. It wasn't even a number in the millions. It was a number with 10 digits. What is this?" Henry whispered, his voice cracking. "This is a joke. Is this a joke?" "I assure you, Mr. Sterling, Pendleton and Gray does not deal in jokes," the lawyer replied softly. "My client is prepared to offer you a settlement of exactly $0.00. In exchange, she will not seek damages for your marital indiscretions, and she will allow you to keep your modest pension. I suggest you take it, because if you fight her, I promise you, she will take the very suit off your back." Henry stared at the paper, the world spinning out of control. The name at the top of the financial disclosure wasn't Caroline Sterling. It read, C.J. Ashford, founder and sole proprietor, Ashford Analytics. The ghost had not just woken up, she had brought the entire system down on his head. Henry Sterling's lungs forgot how to process oxygen. The Manhattan skyline outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of Pendleton, Gray and Associates seemed to tilt on its axis. He stared at the 10-digit number on the preliminary financial disclosure, his vision blurring. Arthur Pendleton sat motionless, a marble statue of a man who had delivered devastating news 1,000 times before. "Ashford Analytics," Henry finally choked out, the syllables feeling like shattered glass in his throat. He looked at his bulldog attorney, Richard Hughes, whose normally aggressive demeanor had entirely evaporated. Richard was pale, his eyes darting across the watermarked paper, as if searching for a typo that wasn't there. "This is a fabrication," Henry said, though his voice lacked any real conviction. He stood up, his legs trembling slightly. "My wife is Caroline Sterling. She uses a Lenovo laptop that's 5 years old. She buys her clothes off the rack at Nordstrom. She doesn't own a hedge fund." "Ashford Analytics is not a hedge fund, Mr. Sterling," Pendleton corrected smoothly, closing his leather portfolio. "It is a proprietary quantitative trading firm, and your wife does not use a Lenovo. She utilizes a custom-built, liquid-cooled server cluster that she engineered herself, directly linked to the fiber-optic backbone of the New York Stock Exchange, a cluster she successfully extracted from your Westport residence while you were attending a gala." The memory of the hobby room hit Henry with the force of a physical blow. The heavy-duty cooling fans he had mocked, the multiple monitors she claimed were for cross-referencing bakery receipts, the dedicated power lines she had insisted on having installed, which he had complained about paying for. "We are done here," Pendleton said, rising from his chair. "You have the settlement offer, $0, no alimony. You walk away with your pension and whatever is currently in your personal checking account. If you attempt to challenge the Westport eviction or the asset division, I will personally ensure that every financial irregularity you have engaged in over the past decade, including the offshore accounts you hid from the IRS during the 2022 audit, is handed over to the federal prosecutor's office. Good day, gentlemen." Henry didn't remember the elevator ride down. He didn't remember the cab ride back to the Midtown offices of Harrison, Lynch, and Davies. He practically sprinted through the glass doors of his firm, ignoring his assistant's greetings, and locked himself in his corner office. He threw himself into his ergonomic chair and hammered his password into his Bloomberg terminal. His hands were shaking so violently he had to type it 3 times. The black screen flickered to life, glowing with orange and green data. He typed in the ticker search, Ashford Analytics. For a man in wealth management, the name should have been familiar, but the truly terrifying money on Wall Street is completely silent. The terminal brought up a sparse, heavily redacted corporate profile, registered in Delaware, founded 9 years ago. No public-facing website, no listed board of directors. Just a single point of contact, a holding company based in Zurich, Switzerland. Henry picked up his desk phone and dialed an internal extension. "Samuel, get in here, now." Samuel was a 24-year-old quantitative analyst at the firm, a math prodigy who spent his days staring at code. 2 minutes later, he knocked and entered, looking nervous. "Samuel," Henry said, turning the monitor toward him. "What do you know about Ashford Analytics?" Samuel's eyes widened, and he let out a low whistle. "Ashford? Where did you hear that name? Mr. Sterling? They're a ghost story." "What does that mean?" Henry snapped. "They're a dark pool operator," Samuel explained, leaning in closer to the screen. "They run high-frequency arbitrage algorithms. Nobody knows who CJ Ashford actually is. The rumor on the quant forums is that they built an AI model that successfully predicted the municipal bond crash 2 years ago. They moved billions, while the rest of the market was bleeding. They make Renaissance technologies look like they're trading with an abacus. Why? Are we trying to court them as a client? Because they don't take outside capital." "No," Henry whispered, the reality finally crushing the last of his denial. "We aren't courting them." He dismissed Samuel and sat in the quiet hum of his office. His wife, the woman he had ordered around, the woman he had cheated on with a 28-year-old junior analyst, the woman he had treated like a slightly dim-witted child, was CJ Ashford. She hadn't just been in the room with him. She had been playing a game he couldn't even comprehend, let alone win. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Chloe. "Are we still on for Le Bernardin tonight?" Quao, Henry stared at the text. He needed Chloe. He needed someone to look at him with admiration, to validate the shrinking core of his ego. He texted back, "Yes, meet me there at 8. He left the office early, needing to go back to Westport to formulate a plan. He would refuse to leave the house. He would hire a forensic accountant. He would fight this. He pulled his leased Porsche Panamera onto the winding, tree-lined road leading to his estate. But as he approached the iron gates, he slammed on the brakes. The gates were chained shut. Parked squarely in the center of the driveway was a black SUV with the logo of Garda World Security emblazoned on the side. 2 men in tactical gear were standing near the intercom. Henry laid on the horn, rolling down his window. "Open the gate! I live here." One of the guards walked over, holding a clipboard. "Henry Sterling?" "Yes, open the damn gate." "I'm sorry, sir," the guard said, his voice completely flat. "We have been retained by the legal owner of this property, the Sterling Family Trust. We have strict instructions that you are no longer permitted on the premises. Your personal belongings have been packed and moved to a climate-controlled storage facility in Stamford. Here is the key and the address." The guard tossed a small, padded envelope through the open window of the Porsche. It landed on the passenger seat with a soft thud. Henry was locked out. His bank accounts were frozen. His house was gone. He drove to Le Bernardin in a state of shock, handing the keys to the valet with trembling hands. Chloe was already at the table, wearing a stunning black cocktail dress, sipping a martini. She smiled brightly as he sat down, but the smile faltered when she saw his face. "Henry, what's wrong? You look terrible." "Caroline," he rasped, signaling the waiter for a double scotch. "She filed for divorce." Chloe's eyes lit up briefly with a predatory gleam. "Oh, well. We knew this was coming, right? It's for the best. You'll give her a fair settlement, and we can finally be open." "You don't understand," Henry said, downing the scotch the moment it arrived. "She took everything. The house was in a trust. She owns it. My accounts are frozen." He looked at her, desperate for comfort. "I'm fighting her, Chloe, but it's going to be ugly. I might need to crash at your place for a while, until my lawyers unfreeze my assets." Chloe slowly set her martini glass down. The warmth entirely vanished from her eyes, replaced by the cold, calculating arithmetic of a junior analyst evaluating a bad asset. "You're locked out of your money?" she asked, her voice dropping an octave. "What about the Westport house? I just told you it's hers." Chloe looked at him for a long, silent moment. She didn't see a titan of industry anymore. She saw a middle-aged man with a drinking problem, a messy divorce, and no liquidity. "Henry," Chloe said smoothly, reaching for her Prada clutch. I think, with everything going on, you need space to figure this out. I can't get dragged into a messy divorce. It would ruin my reputation at Harrison, Lynch and Davies." "Chloe, wait." Henry reached across the table, but she pulled her hand back. "I'll pay for the drinks," she said, standing up. She didn't look back as she walked out of the restaurant, leaving Henry entirely alone in the dim light of the dining room. While Henry's world was collapsing in Manhattan, Caroline Sterling was 30,000 feet in the air, flying in a private Dassault Falcon 8X over the Bering Sea. She was dressed in thermal layers, the oversized cashmere sweaters of her Connecticut life, replaced by high-grade Arctic survival gear. The encrypted tablet on her lap glowed quietly in the darkened cabin. A single message from Arthur Pendleton sat in her secure inbox. "The respondent has received the disclosures. The Westport property is secured. Checkmate." Caroline didn't smile. She simply locked the tablet and looked out the window into the endless, dark expanse of the Russian Far East. The algorithms that ran Ashford Analytics were brilliant, but they hadn't taught her the patience required to dismantle Henry Sterling. Mathematics could predict market volatility, but it couldn't teach a person how to sit in a room with a man they despised for 10 years, smiling, nodding, and slowly weaving a net so tight he wouldn't realize he was caught until he was already suffocating. For that kind of endurance, she had to return to the source. The Falcon landed smoothly on the icy runway of Yakutsk Airport. From there, it was a chartered Mi-8 helicopter ride deep into the heart of Yakutia, Siberia, the coldest permanently inhabited region on the planet. As the helicopter descended towards the remote, snow-buried village of Oymyakon, the temperature display on the bulkhead read -65 degrees Fahrenheit. The air outside wasn't just cold. It was a physical force, a heavy, freezing entity that snapped trees in half and shattered steel. The helicopter touched down in a clearing near the edge of the boreal forest. Caroline stepped out, her breath instantly turning to a thick cloud of ice crystals. The frozen snow crunched loudly under her heavy boots. She walked for half a mile through the dense, snow-laden pines until the tree line broke, revealing a small, heavily insulated timber cabin. Smoke curled aggressively from the stone chimney, fighting against the crushing atmosphere. Caroline pushed open the heavy wooden door, immediately hit by the intense heat of a massive cast-iron stove. Sitting in a rocking chair beside the fire was an 80-year-old woman. She was carving a piece of birch wood with a hunting knife. Her face was a map of deep wrinkles, weathered by decades of brutal winters, but her eyes were the exact same piercing, calculating shade of blue as Caroline's. "You took your time," the old woman rasped in English, not looking up from her carving. "Hello, grandmother," Caroline said, pulling off her fur-lined hood. Clara Ashford was a legend in her own right. Born in Chicago, she had moved to Yakutia in the late 1980s as part of a geological survey team and simply never left. She had outlived her colleagues, outlived the Soviet Union, and built a life entirely off the grid. She hunted her own meat, chopped her own wood, and survived in a place that actively tried to kill its inhabitants every single day. She had raised Caroline for several years after Caroline's parents died in a car crash, teaching the young girl that survival wasn't about strength. It was about absolute, unflinching adaptability. Clara put the knife down and looked at her granddaughter. The Wall Street boy. Is he finished? He's finished, Caroline said, walking over to the fire and holding her hands out to the heat. He has no house, no money, and the girl he was sleeping with just left him. He thinks he lost a bookkeeping wife. He never knew you, Clara grunted, standing up with surprising agility and pouring 2 mugs of thick, boiling black tea. She handed one to Caroline. I told you when you married him, men who make a lot of noise are usually hollow inside. Like rotten birch. They snap when the frost hits. He didn't snap, Clara, Caroline said softly, taking a sip of the scalding tea. I systematically dismantled him. Clara smiled, a rare, terrifying expression that showed surprisingly perfectly white teeth. Good. You used the cold. You let him think he was the fire, and you just waited until he burned himself out. It took 10 years. Time is nothing, the elderly woman said, gesturing to the frozen wasteland outside the frosted window. The ice here has waited 1,000,000 years. 10 years to secure your empire, to blind him with his own ego, and to walk away with everything. That is a blink of an eye. You did well, Caroline. You survived the environment. Caroline looked around the small, sparse cabin. This was where the foundation of Ashford Analytics was actually born. It wasn't in a dorm room at MIT or a high-rise in Manhattan. It was here, in Yakutia, where Clara had taught her that if you can understand the patterns of the most chaotic, lethal environment on Earth, you can understand anything. The algorithms Caroline wrote for the stock market were essentially survival models, predicting the brutal winters of financial crashes and hoarding resources when the sun was shining. Will you stay for the winter? Clara asked, sitting back down and picking up her carving knife. Caroline looked out the window at the encroaching dark. In New York, Henry was probably sitting in a cheap hotel room, furiously dialing lawyers who would demand retainers he could no longer afford. He was trapped in a blizzard of his own making, and he had no survival skills whatsoever. Yes, Caroline said, feeling a genuine smile touch her lips for the first time in a decade. I think I'll stay for a while. The air here is finally clean enough to breathe. The fluorescent lights of the mid-tier Marriott in downtown Stamford flickered with an irritating, rhythmic buzz. It had been exactly 3 weeks since Henry Sterling had been handed the padded envelope containing his storage unit keys. The luxurious, meticulously tailored life he had built was completely gone, replaced by beige wallpaper, the smell of industrial carpet cleaner, and the terrifying hollow reality of a frozen bank account. Henry sat on the edge of the stiff mattress, staring blindly at a muted television screen. He was wearing the same charcoal suit trousers he had worn 2 days ago, his usually pristine white dress shirt wrinkled and unbuttoned at the collar. The man who had sneered at waiters and belittled his wife for failing to correctly organize his dry cleaning was now rationing miniature bottles of hotel shampoo. His iPhone buzzed on the cheap laminate nightstand. He snatched it up, desperate for a lifeline. The caller ID flashed Charles Montgomery. Charles was the senior managing director at Harrison, Lynch and Davis. He was a ruthless, aristocratic financier who valued firm reputation above human life. Henry cleared his throat, trying to summon the booming, confident baritone that had won him his promotion just a month prior. "Charles, good morning," Henry said, forcing a hearty tone. "I'm just sorting through some minor legal red tape. I'll be back in the office by Thursday." "You will not be returning to the office, Henry," Charles said. The voice on the other end of the line was devoid of any warmth. It was the tone of a man addressing a stranger. Henry's stomach plummeted. "Charles, please, it's just a messy divorce. The asset freeze is temporary. My lawyer, Richard Hughes, is filing an emergency injunction to unlock my capital today. I'm handling it." "You are handling nothing," Charles corrected smoothly. "Do you have any idea who your wife is, Henry?" I received a very polite, very terrifying phone call yesterday evening from Arthur Pendleton," Charles continued, his voice dripping with venom. "He informed me, as a courtesy, that Harrison, Lynch and Davies is currently heavily invested in several leveraged positions that conflict directly with the proprietary algorithms run by Ashford Analytics. He also politely suggested that any firm employing a man who is currently attempting to defraud the founder of Ashford Analytics might find themselves targeted by a rather aggressive short-selling campaign." Henry felt the blood drain from his face. "Charles, she's bluffing. Caroline is a mouse. She doesn't have the stomach to take on a major wealth management firm." "A mouse?" Charles let out a dry, humorless laugh. "The SEC quietly updated the beneficial ownership filings for Ashford Analytics this morning. Wall Street is tearing itself apart, trying to confirm the rumors. Your mouse of a wife moves an average of $2 billion in daily trading volume. She is an apex predator, Henry, and you are a bleeding piece of meat tied to our front door. As of this morning, your employment is terminated with cause, citing a violation of the firm's moral turpitude clause regarding your highly public affair with Miss Kensington." "You can't do that!" Henry yelled, panic finally shattering his composure. "My severance will be held in escrow, pending the resolution of your divorce proceedings, as dictated by a court order filed by Mr. Pendleton an hour ago," Charles finished coldly. "Do not contact this firm again. Security has been instructed to escort you off the premises if you appear." The line went dead. Henry dropped the phone. He was hyperventilating, the walls of the cheap hotel room closing in on him. He immediately dialed Richard Hughes. The phone rang 6 times before it went to a receptionist. "Law offices of Hughes and Associates. Put Richard on, now. It's Henry Sterling." "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling. Mr. Hughes is no longer representing you." "What? He has to represent me. I signed a retainer." "A retainer you funded with a credit card that has since been declined," the receptionist said, her tone entirely professional and entirely unyielding. "Furthermore, Mr. Hughes has formally withdrawn as your counsel, citing irreconcilable strategic differences. A formal letter has been mailed to your P.O. Box. Have a pleasant day." Click. Henry stood up, his vision blurring with rage and terror. He had to fix this. He had to find her. He tore through his contacts, calling former friends, country club acquaintances, and colleagues. No one answered. The ecosystem of extreme wealth was entirely transactional, and word had already spread. Henry Sterling was a toxic asset. He had one desperate play left. He walked out of the hotel, hailed a cab he could barely afford, and gave the driver the address of the Westport estate. He didn't care about the security guards or the trust. He was going to break a window, sit in his own living room, and refuse to leave until Caroline faced him. An hour later, the cab pulled up to the wrought iron gates of the estate, but the Garda World Security SUV was gone. The gates were wide open. Henry frowned, paying the driver with the last of his cash, and walked up the sweeping quarter-mile driveway. The massive 10,000-square-foot mansion loomed ahead, quiet and pristine. But as he got closer, he noticed a large wooden sign hammered into the manicured front lawn. He broke into a jog, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He reached the sign and stopped dead, his knees buckling. The sign featured the logo of the local Westport Historical Society. It read, "The Caroline Ashford Sanctuary for Domestic Violence Survivors, opening spring 2027. Donated in perpetuity by the Ashford Foundation." She hadn't just taken his house. She had eradicated his legacy. She had turned the ultimate symbol of his ego, the fortress where he had isolated and belittled her, into a public monument to her survival and his cruelty. Henry fell to his knees on the freezing November grass. For the first time in his life, he didn't scream or curse or blame someone else. He simply wept, the loud, ugly tears of a man who realized he had been playing checkers against a grandmaster who had owned the board since the very first move. 72 hours later, the financial world erupted. The story broke, not in a tabloid, but on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, penned by Sarah Jenkins, one of the most feared and respected financial investigative journalists in the country. The headline was merciless in its precision: "The Westport Whale, How a Subordinate Wife Built a Silicon Empire in the Shadows of a Wall Street Vice President." The article meticulously detailed the architecture of Ashford Analytics. It traced the routing of the dark pool trades back to the Zurich Holding Company, and from Zurich back to the heavily encrypted, custom-built server farm that had sat, disguised as a hobby room, in a Connecticut mansion. Jenkins painted a devastating portrait of Henry Sterling, a man so blinded by his own narcissism and misogyny that he had slept beside a financial titan for a decade, utterly convinced she was a helpless dependent. By noon, the article was the only thing anyone in Lower Manhattan was talking about. On the trading floors of the New York Stock Exchange, men in tailored suits stared at the Bloomberg terminals, watching as the market reacted to the revelations. The mystery of C.J. Ashford had been solved, and the truth was infinitely more humiliating for the establishment than any rumor could have been. In her corner office at Harrison, Lynch and Davies, Chloe Kensington read the article on her tablet, her face pale and her hands trembling. She had tethered her ambition to a sinking ship. Her colleagues were already looking at her differently, not as the protégée of a rising star, but as the punchline to the greatest joke Wall Street had seen in a decade. Deep in the heart of Yakutia, where the sun barely breached the horizon for a few hours a day, Caroline sat by the cast-iron stove in Clara's cabin. Outside, a blizzard was raging, howling against the thick timber walls with a ferocity that would freeze a man to death in minutes. Inside, it was sweltering. Caroline wore a heavy wool sweater, a mug of black tea resting on her knee. On the small wooden table beside her sat her encrypted satellite tablet, the screen glowing brightly against the dim light of the cabin. She was watching the live ticker of a specific fund, the Harrison, Lynch and Davies Global Opportunities Portfolio. It was the flagship fund of Henry's former employer, the very fund he had helped manage. Clara walked over, carrying a bundle of fresh birch wood. She dropped it next to the stove and peered over Caroline's shoulder at the screen full of plummeting red graphs. "You are bleeding them," Clara noted, her raspy voice holding a note of dark approval. "Just a little," Caroline replied, her tone perfectly conversational. They built a massive, over-leveraged position on commercial real estate in the tri-state area. It was arrogant. It was sloppy. I simply instructed my algorithms to aggressively short their specific debt obligations. They are currently losing about $14 million an hour. "Retribution?" Clara asked, sitting in her rocking chair. "Correction," Caroline amended softly. "Henry's firm enabled his behavior. They rewarded his arrogance. I'm just correcting the market imbalance." Suddenly the tablet chimed. It wasn't an email or an automated trade alert. It was an incoming audio call, routed through 5 different proxy servers to protect her location. Only one person had been given the temporary, one-time use decryption key to make this call: Arthur Pendleton. Caroline tapped the screen to accept. "Go ahead, Arthur." "Good evening, Mrs. Sterling." Arthur's cultured, unflappable voice echoed through the cabin's small speaker. "Or should I say Miss Ashford? I apologize for the intrusion, but we have a slight anomaly." "Did they reject the $0 settlement?" "No," Arthur replied. "Mr. Sterling signed the settlement papers an hour ago. He surrendered his claim to all marital assets, accepted the terms regarding his pension, and waived his right to trial. He is entirely neutralized." "Then what is the anomaly, Arthur?" "He is currently sitting in the lobby of my office building," the lawyer explained. "He circumvented building security and refuses to leave. He is demanding exactly 2 minutes of phone time with you. My security team is prepared to forcibly remove him and hand him over to the NYPD for trespassing. Shall I give the order?" Caroline looked at the fire. She thought about the 10 years of quiet condescension, the lonely nights, the brazen infidelity, and the endless, exhausting performance of making herself small so Henry could feel big. The game was over. The board was cleared. "No, Arthur," Caroline said slowly. "Patch him through." A click echoed over the line, followed by a burst of static, and then the sound of ragged, heavy breathing. "Caroline!" Henry's voice was unrecognizable. It was raw, shattered, and stripped of all its polished veneer. It sounded like the voice of a man who had been wandering in a desert for weeks. "Hello, Henry," she said, her voice smooth and cold as the Siberian ice outside. "Why?" The single word cracked as it left his throat. "You ruined me, Caroline. You took the house. You took my job. You destroyed my reputation. You could have just filed for divorce. You could have just walked away with half. Why did you have to annihilate me?" Caroline took a slow sip of her tea. She didn't feel anger. She didn't feel triumph. She felt the profound, peaceful emptiness of a solved equation. "I didn't annihilate you, Henry," she replied, staring into the flames of the stove. "I simply stopped protecting you from yourself. For 10 years, my silence was the only thing holding up the illusion of your greatness. All I did was stop talking. You did the rest." "You're a monster," he sobbed into the phone, the sound echoing pathetically in the quiet, brutal wilderness of Yakutia. "You're not the woman I married." "You're right. I'm not," Caroline said softly. "The woman you married never existed. She was a ghost. And ghosts, Henry, don't leave a forwarding address." Without waiting for a response, she tapped the screen, severing the connection permanently. She picked up a thick piece of birch wood, tossed it into the roaring fire, and closed the heavy iron door of the stove. 18 months later, the spring thaw finally reached the Connecticut coastline. The manicured lawns of Westport were turning a vibrant, wealthy green, and the air smelled of blooming hydrangeas and expensive sea salt. On a bright Tuesday morning, a crowd gathered outside the wrought iron gates of what used to be the Sterling estate. Local politicians, national domestic advocacy leaders, and a throng of reporters stood before a massive, gleaming mahogany door. At the front of the press pack was Sarah Jenkins of the Wall Street Journal, her notebook ready. The brass plaque, bolted to the stone pillar beside the gate, caught the morning sun. It read, "The Caroline Ashford Sanctuary. Founded 2027. Seed capital provided by the final remnants of a broken marriage, multiplied by the algorithms of survival." 60 miles away, in a grim, fluorescent-lit strip mall in Paramus, New Jersey, Henry Sterling sat behind a particle-board desk. He was wearing a polyester blend suit that bunched awkwardly at the shoulders. The pristine Rolex was long gone, sold to cover the legal fees of a frantic, doomed attempt to countersue for emotional distress, a case a Manhattan judge had thrown out in less than 12 minutes. Now, a cheap plastic Casio watch sat on his wrist, ticking loudly in the stifling air of the Liberty Community Bank branch. He was currently employed as a junior loan officer, a position he had begged for after 9 months of rejections. His days consisted of processing auto loans for used sedans and explaining overdraft fees to college students. Henry stared blankly at the small, muted television mounted in the corner of the bank's waiting area. A local news channel was broadcasting the ribbon-cutting ceremony of the sanctuary live. He watched as the mayor of Westport snipped a thick red ribbon, the crowd bursting into applause. He leaned closer to the screen, his heart hammering a painful rhythm against his ribs. He was searching the crowd. He was looking for a glimpse of an oversized cashmere sweater, a flash of calculating blue eyes, a hint of the woman whose shadow he now lived completely inside. She wasn't there. Arthur Pendleton, looking as immaculate and terrifying as ever in a navy bespoke suit, stepped up to the podium on the screen to speak on his client's behalf. Caroline Ashford had not set foot on American soil since the night she left. She remained an absolute ghost, a digital phantom who governed a multi-billion-dollar market share from the absolute edge of the earth. Henry's desk phone rang, shattering his trance. It was a sharp, grating sound. He picked it up, his hand trembling slightly. "Sterling," he answered, his voice lacking any of the booming resonance it once held. "Henry, it's Mr. Gable," the branch manager's voice barked through the receiver. "I need you in my office. We have a corporate restructuring announcement." A cold dread pooled in Henry's stomach. Restructuring was Wall Street code for a bloodbath. He hung up, stood on legs that felt like lead, and walked across the stained carpet to the manager's glass-walled office. Gable, a balding man who chewed on the ends of his pens, didn't look up when Henry entered. He simply slid a single piece of corporate letterhead across the desk. "I'm sorry, Henry. The bank's parent company was bought out in a hostile takeover early this morning," Gable said, rubbing his temples. "The new holding company is liquidating underperforming branches. Paramus is first on the chopping block. We're all done here. Pack up your desk." Henry stared at the letterhead. His vision tunneled. The logo at the top of the paper wasn't the familiar crest of Liberty Community Bank's old parent company. It was a minimalist geometric A, Ashford Capital Holdings. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. She hadn't just destroyed his past. She had actively purchased his present, just to burn it down again. The game wasn't over. For a quantitative algorithm, the game never ended. It only optimized. She had found the tiny, pathetic corner of the world where he had tried to hide, bought the ground beneath his feet, and evicted him a second time. Henry stumbled out of the office, his breathing ragged. He didn't pack his desk. He just walked out the sliding glass doors into the hot New Jersey parking lot, a man entirely erased by the quiet wife he had once told to fetch his coffee. Half a world away, the brutal winter of Yakutia had finally broken, surrendering to a brief, fierce Siberian summer. The snow had melted, revealing an endless, vibrant expanse of green taiga. Caroline Ashford sat on the wooden porch of Clara's cabin. She was wearing a simple cotton shirt, her face turned towards the pale sunlight. A satellite terminal rested on a small table beside her, displaying a stream of green market data and a single execution confirmation. Liquidation of Liberty retail banking sector, complete. Clara walked out onto the porch, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. She handed one to Caroline and looked at the screen. "Another piece of dead wood cleared?" Clara asked, sitting heavily in her rocking chair. "The last piece," Caroline murmured. She tapped a command, and the terminal went completely dark. The encrypted tunnels closed. The algorithms went into silent, autonomous maintenance mode. There's nothing left of him to dismantle. The architecture of his ego is entirely flattened. "And you?" Clara asked, her piercing eyes fixing on her granddaughter. "Are you finally done playing the ghost?" Caroline looked out at the vast, untamed wilderness. She had survived the suffocating confines of a toxic marriage by building an invisible fortress. She had used silence as a weapon and mathematics as her shield. But looking at the endless horizon of Oymyakon, she realized she no longer needed to hide. "No," Caroline said, a genuine, radiant smile breaking across her face. She took a sip of the cold tea. "I think it's time the ghost became flesh. I think it's time Ashford Analytics built something new." She leaned back in her chair, listening to the wind rustle through the ancient pines. She had walked out of the marriage in silence, but the empire she was about to build would echo across the world for generations. The loudest person in the room, is rarely the most dangerous. Caroline's story is a chilling reminder that true power doesn't need to scream to be heard. It operates in the shadows, calculating, adapting, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Henry Sterling built his entire life on the fragile foundation of his own ego, completely blind to the silent architect sleeping right beside him. In the end, it wasn't an explosive argument that destroyed him, but the terrifying precision of a woman who simply decided She had had enough.